Hi, welcome back to the Fantasy Football Profits. Thanks for joining us today. This is our week 2 start sit video. Week 1 of football is officially done now. It was fun to get out there and see teams get on the field. My Vikings won. My fantasy football team did well. Although with that said, it's only 1 week. Things can change very quickly. Now in fantasy football, it's important to make the right waiver moves, have a good draft, but you still need to make the right start sit moves. And nothing more frustrating than having a good lineup and losing the game because you left points on your bench. And so we want to give you guys some food for thought. Now what we always say is we're going to give you some ideas, but you need to contextualize this information. Every league is different. Your bench size, your waiver wire availability, your scoring system, things like that. So it's important that you take all these things and you flex that into your league. Another thing I think is important, Ryan, and you and I had talked about this a little bit ago. We're still early in the league. It's only week 1, so we have a little bit of trend to look at, but it's really hard to lock down trends until I think you hit like 2 weeks, 2 or 3. At that point, you can begin to lock down. Does this defense give up a lot of points to tight ends? How is this offense trending? Things like that. So once again, I think we're doing better this week than we were last week, but I still think you got to wait maybe another week or 2 before we can definitively say here are the trends that we are seeing in the NFL. Things can fluctuate pretty quickly, and we used an example in our last video how the Rams in 1 year were the worst offense in the NFL, and the very next year were the #1 offense in the NFL. So things can fluctuate quickly in the NFL. The other thing we want to tell you out there is if you have specific questions about start sit video, we'll do our best to answer them on the bottom. But I want to say this out there, sometimes we can get inundated with a lot of questions. So if you want to make sure that your question gets answered, we have Patreon there. And if you're a Patreon subscriber, we make sure to answer your question. We prioritize you, and we make sure to go very much in depth for you guys so that you can understand not only why we say you should start this guy or sit that guy, but the rationale behind it. So once again, we'll do our best to answer your questions on the bottom of the video. But if you want to guarantee that we answer your question in a prompt manner, we do it on Patreon.
And I just want to throw in there too, I check typically at least once a day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, the comments, because for some reason I'm not getting notifications on those things. So if you don't see a response right away, trust me, at some point that throughout the day I will get back to you and I will be able to respond to your questions. So just be patient if you have to, but I try and get back as soon as possible. I check, like I said, at least once, but usually 2 or 3 times a day on those.
All right, so I want to get right into the video. Our last video we did was really long, an hour and 20 minutes. We're hoping to keep it closer to an hour today. Let's get into the very first game. So the first game we have is the Ravens versus the Bengals. So I want to talk about the quarterback position. We'll look at Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco had struggled for a couple of years, but he had a good preseason, and he followed it up with a good first week versus the Bills. He had 236 passing yards and 3 TDs, no interceptions. And that was really in limited time. He really didn't play much the second half. Second half was all Lamar Jackson. He's got some new weapons around him. Got Snead, Brown, Crabtree. Now he's playing a Bengals defense that last year was in the bottom third of the league and didn't look that great against Indy per se. And so is he a guy that you want to start? Well, I want to have some concerns. I don't think that he's ever been an elite fantasy quarterback, Joe Flacco, in terms of that. I think that he benefited the fact that they played the Bills. The Bills' offense was brutal, which meant that the Ravens' offense had a lot of extra plays and snaps on the field. That's not going to happen this week. Obviously, the Bengals are going to give a lot more competition there. That's going to be a lot closer game. I would say that Joe Flacco, you would start him if you're in 2 quarterback leagues or somebody you could stream this week. Yes, I think you'd be comfortable starting him against the Bengals. I would say he's outside of my top 15 in terms of rankings. For me this week, he rounds about 16 to 20 range based on your scoring system in that league. Now let's take a look at Andy Dalton. I started him last week. I actually had him in the league, but he was very solid for me. Now, it was against a very bad Indy defense. Now he faces a Raven defense that's a very good defense. In fact, they're very good against the pass. In 2017, they were top 10, allowing only 213 passing yards per game. So I would sit Andy Dalton unless you're desperate. I like to see how he's going to do a second week against a very good defense. Once again, he did well last week, but that was against Indy. So I would probably lean towards sitting Andy Dalton this week if you can do that, if you can spare that. Joe Mixon, let's get to the running backs there. So we predicted that he would have a good rebound year, and he had a great game 1 so far. It looked really good. So for me, I look at where he's at, the running back situation out there, and for me, he's a must-start as a running back 2, but don't expect him to do what he did in week 1 against the Ravens. Once again, that Ravens defense is very solid there, but I definitely think he's a guy that you can start. He is going to get a majority of the carries, and they use him very actively in the passing game. And then that brings us to Giovanni Bernard. I would sit with him. Joe Mixon's on a roll right now. Barring any injury, I wouldn't go with Bernard. And then the other thing is Bernard has value in PPR leagues, typically because he's good with his hands. He's great in the passing game. But Joe Mixon is also very active in the passing game. So I would sit Giovanni Bernard. Now, as far as Alec Collins go, he had a TD. He did struggle to run the ball this week. But I think if you really look at it, actually the whole Ravens team struggled to run the ball. And I think the reason why is because that game got out of hand and the play calling became predictable, and the Bills have a good front seven, so they're able to slow down the run. I wouldn't worry about his struggles. I like Al Collins. I think he's going to have a good year. I think it's also noteworthy that in the second half of the game, the Ravens sat their starters, and that included Collins. Now, Dixon got a lot of carries at that point, but the fact that Dixon was brought in essentially as the backup really speaks to the confidence they have in Collins. Dixon ran as a clear backup, so you need to start Collins as a running back too. And then to further add to that, Dixon's going to miss a few weeks with an injury, so don't worry about it. Al Collins as a running back too this week, and I think he'll be just fine. I think he'll rebound well against the Bengals. As far as Javarius Allen goes, I would sit him. He vultured a TD in that game. With Collins on the bench. Now, at times he can have PPR value. He does have good hands, but I don't think he's trustworthy enough to start him. So I would probably sit Javarius Allen. Then, of course, Kenneth Dixon, we mentioned that he's injured, so don't worry about that. Let's get to the wide receivers. You got A.J. Green. He struggled somewhat last year against the Ravens, but he had a nice week one, and he's too talented to sit at this point. So I would start A.J. Green, but I would lower your expectations. I expected to have maybe 5 catches, 80 yards. Hopefully you'll get a bonus touchdown in there. I don't expect him to be huge, but I think he'll be solid. Then you've got Ross. Ross is really developing into a nice, promising young wide receiver, but he did get a touchdown, but he only had 1 catch for like 5 yards, I believe it. So he's not getting enough targets at this point to trust him. Plus, he's going against the Ravens defense, so I would probably sit him and all other Cincinnati wide receivers. Now let's shift gears and look at the wide receivers for the Ravens. You got Brown and Snead. They both actually looked nice in that game. They both scored. Brown was actually talked up by the Ravens staff before the season. He's been a guy that at times when he's healthy has proven to be good. Concern I have there, one, they both did well because they scored 47 points. They dominated plays and possessions against a terrible Bills team. The Bills may be the worst team in the NFL. We'll see how that plays out. But because they're limited targets and because we don't know how that distribution is going to be, I see Snead in them and Brown. I would sit Snead. I need to see another week from him, and Brown for me is a wide receiver 4. I'd prefer to sit him if I could help it. And Michael Crabtree is a guy that is their number 1 wide receiver. In this matchup, I would start him as a wide receiver 2. As far as tight ends go, I like Mark Andrews. He looked good. He could have had better numbers, but once again, they pulled their foot off the gas in that game. But it's too early to trust him unless you're really desperate. So I like Mark Andrews long term, but I don't like him in this game. I still want to see a little bit more. And then there's Tyler Eifert. Eifert, when he's healthy, has been a very productive tight end, especially in the red zone. I would start him. I think with the Ravens bringing pressure, he'll become a check down man who will have a very solid game. As far as kickers go, you got to start Tucker. Tucker's a stud. And Bullock is a decent start. He's not a great play, but if you need somebody off the waiver wire, you could use him. He's outside the top 15. I would start the Ravens defense, and I would sit the Bengals defense. So that's my take on the game there.
Yeah, sounds good.
So that brings us to the Falcons and the Panthers.
Yeah, with the Falcons and the Panthers, we're going to do things a little bit different from the way that Rob did them. I actually set my thing up here. I'm going to go team by team. We're going to start with the away team, and then we're going to go to the home team. So first of all, we have the Carolina Panthers. The game last week with the Cowboys, a home game for the Panthers, it was kind of ugly on both ends of the field. Cam Newton didn't have a lot of passing yards. He was more effective than his typical 60% or so. He got around the 65 to 66% range, but didn't have a lot of passing yards, 160 yards, 161 I believe it was. No touchdowns in the passing game. But I mean, it's Cam Newton. He did lead the team in carries and lead the team in rushing yards this week, and had a rushing touchdown. So just the rushing ability alone, and the fact that he is a threat to run the ball in the red zone, and especially inside the 5-yard line, you do need to start Cam Newton this week if he is on your team. Now, moving on to the running backs, we have Christian McCaffrey. He led the entire team in touches. He had 10 rushes for 50 yards with 5 yards per rush average. And he also had 6 catches in the passing game, so he led the team in catches. He actually scored 15.5 fantasy points in PPR, which is a pretty good rate. And in the future, he's going to be scoring some touchdowns this year. They didn't quite get up to that 25 touch mark that they were talking about, but he's going to see the ball quite a bit more, and they're going to have better games. But McCaffrey's definitely low-end RB1, high-end RB2 this week. You have to start McCaffrey. Now, C.J. Anderson, he actually didn't have a horrible day. His game looks like a lot different if he didn't fumble that ball and he gets it in the end zone. That's an 8-point swing right there. He could have had a 20-point game. But I think C.J. Anderson right now, as it sits, is probably a low-end flex option or RB3. If you absolutely need to start him, then he's an option for you. But if you don't need to, you probably have better options on your team. So just take a look at what you have on your bench. Like we said, contextualize your roster. CJ Anderson is probably an RB3 outside the top 24 for me this week. Now on to the wide receivers. Well, I'm going to go to the tight ends next. Actually, Greg Olsen left this game with an injury. He was seen on the sidelines with a boot. He was said to have injured that same right foot that he had issues with last year. He's going to miss a significant amount of time. And when he's missing time, the wide receivers and Christian McCaffrey actually have an uptick in their production in recent years. So, I'm sorry, well, last year especially. But Devin Funchess in recent years. So, as far as the tight ends go, Ian Thomas looks to be the guy that's going to take the role, as he's a rookie tight end, and he is a sit for me this week. We just need to see what he's going to be able to do before we decide on him. And now, like I said, there's an uptick in Devin Funchess. Devin Funchess is going to be a start for me this week. He's probably a high-end wide receiver 3, but possibly low-end wide receiver 2 with all the extra time he's going to get. They are playing indoors this week in the Falcons Stadium on the turf, so he's going to be able to get the ball. He had 3 catches for 41 last week, so kind of a productive day as far as wide receivers on that team, but not productive for fantasy standards. But he should see an increase and possibly start to get end zone time. He is the wide receiver 1, and we're not starting DJ Moore or any of the other wide receivers. Torrey Smith for the Panthers. On to the defense. I actually would start the defense this week. The Falcons' offense did not look great in Philadelphia. Now, part of that could have been the weather, part of that could have been the game script, but down in the red zone, they just got stopped over and over again. So Steve Sarkisian is getting the Boo Birds coming out on him for his play calling, and they just can't seem to get the ball and into the end zone. So I would actually start the Panthers defense and see what happens there. And Graham Gano, same thing I said last week with kickers. If they're on your team, you're probably starting him. He's probably, in the top 15 range for kickers. So if you want Graham Gano, he's probably on your team. But if he's out there on the waiver wire and you don't have a better option, he is a start this week. On to the Atlanta Falcons. Matt Ryan. I'm actually going to sit Matt Ryan this week. I want to be able to see what he's going to do. And honestly, with all the other games, there are just way better options out there. He might be a low-end quarterback 1 in a 16-team league, but you're probably only starting him in a 2-quarterback league just because there are such better options out there this week. I actually went down the list, and there are 20 good quarterbacks that I could think of that I would want to start this week, and Matt Ryan was in that lower end of that group. Now, running backs, Devontae Freeman, he had a knee issue after the first game against the Eagles. He also had that issue with a knee last year. If he does not play, which it sounds like he will play, but if he doesn't, Tevin Coleman moves into RB2 range. But as of now, Tevin Coleman is probably RB3 in PPR, and Devontae Freeman's RB2. He should be able to get the end zone at some point this season, but we're starting Freeman for sure, and Coleman probably as a running back 3 in PPR, but outside that range in standard scoring. And Julio Jones is a must start every week. Last week I wore the Antonio Brown jersey. He got a touchdown this week. I'm hoping for the Julio. He's just an absolute target monster. 19 targets. For some reason they didn't have him on the field when they had first and goal for 4 straight plays. He got them all the way down into the red zone on that first drive against the Eagles, and they just took him off the field and forgot to put him back in. So he's an absolute target monster, though. 19 targets, 10 catches last week. He also had a rush for 11 yards. So Julio's a must start. And I'm not starting Ridley. He did not seem to show up at all last week. Still kind of wait and see mode on him, and not starting Mohamed Sanu this week. Austin Hooper is also a sit for me this week. I don't see it from him. I haven't seen it yet. Last year he had, I think I mentioned this in the last video, he had 5 targets or less in 12 of his 16 games and 3 catches or less in 11 of 16 games. So he's just not very productive. They don't seem to get him the ball a whole lot. So as of now, I am sitting with Hooper until we see more. And I would start the Falcons defense. Like I said, that Panthers game last week against the Cowboys was brutal. And I don't foresee them having a high-scoring offense as of right now. Like Rob said in the beginning, we could see how game scripts and flows start to work out. We don't really have a trend yet, but if it's any indicator of what we saw last week, that offense is going to run through McCaffrey and Cam Newton and hopefully some Funchess, but that's about all they have right now. So I would start the Falcons defense, even though they lost one of their key safeties, and see what we can get out of that. And you're definitely starting Matt Bryant this week as your kicker.
All right, sounds good. So here we are with the Chargers and the Bills. So I'll get right into the quarterbacks. Look at Philip Rivers. I would start him this week. I think he's a very good play. Last week he had a very good game, 424 passing yards, 3 TDs. He's got good weapons around him. You got Keenan Allen and you got Mike Williams, who's very up and coming. He's got good. You got Gordon, Eckler, who are great backs in the passing game. So I think he's a top 12 this week for me. Start. I like him. You look at the Bills. You got either Peterman, Josh Allen. I don't really care who it is. You need to stay away. That is an ugly situation. We assume the Chargers defense will rebound against them. It sounds like this week Joey Bosa should be back in there. So bad quarterback play. They don't have a lot of good weapons. Stay away from the Bills. As far as running backs go, look at Melvin Gordon. He ran well, had a good yards per carry, which has been the one thing that's kind of hindered him. He get 4.3 yards per carry. He's very active in the passing game. He had a lot of catches. He's a running back one must start. You need to start him. Then you got Austin Eckler. He had a very good week. I think he's a great handcuff to Gordon. Now, normally I'd be concerned about volume. Do you start Austin Eckler? Gordon's going to be the go-to guy there, but I think a big win here. In fact, I would be all that surprised if this is another blowout victory over the Bills. And so I think Eckler's actually going to see some action. So I would consider starting him as a flex player in RB3 in deeper PPR leagues, nothing else. And once again, you're not going to start him in anything other than that. As far as McCoy goes, he's really the only Buffalo Bill that's worth considering starting at this point. But age 30, he's older. He declined last season. The offense is bad. The good sign with him is he's got good hands, so he can be used in the passing game when they fall behind. He is a true 3-down back. With that said, I would say that he's probably a running back 3 if you don't have any better options out there. Once again, this whole team looks like they're a mess. I would sit Chris Ivory. Only an injury to McCoy makes him relevant. Let's go to the wide receivers. They got Keenan Allen. He's a wide receiver 1 must start. You need to start him. And then there's Mike Williams. I actually like Mike Williams. He's a first-round pick. Last year had some problems with his back. He struggled a little bit. But I see him this week as a wide receiver 3 in leagues that are over 12 teams as far as size goes. He had a nice day last week with 5 catches, 81 yards. His day started slow but got better and better as it went on, and he looked a lot better than Benjamin or Williams. I think it's only a matter of time before he becomes the number 2 guy in that offense, and he's starting opposite of Allen. They look at Calvin Benjamin. He had 7 targets, 1 catch, 10 yards. I'm not a big fan of Calvin Benjamin. This is a bad offense. I think he's overrated. But because he is a number 1 wide receiver for the Bills, maybe you could consider him, but I see him more as a wide receiver 5. Plus, he's going to face Casey Hayward, so really, you'd be best to stay away from Calvin Benjamin this week. I would sit all other wideouts in this game. As far as tight ends go, I know a lot of people are excited that Antonio Gates is back, but he's older. I think he's going to be a red zone threat this year. He's still got good hands and a big body, but he just doesn't have that separation or speed anymore. So I would sit him, and I would sell other tight ends in that game. As far as kickers go, I would start Caleb Sturgis. He's going to be a good volume play simply because I think that offense is going to score a lot of points. I think they're going to dominate the Bills overall. He's not top 10. I would sit Steven Hauschka for the Bills. Who knows? There's a chance that offense could get shut out. You never know. As far as defenses go, I would start the Chargers defense. I think they're going to recover this week, and I would sit the Bills defense. So that's my take on that game. So you're up for the Vikings and the Packers. So
Yeah, big rivalry.
Big
game
rivalry,
for you.
yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm going to start with the Packers. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to start with the Vikings, the away team. With the Vikings, it's pretty much the same as last week. We're going to start all of our Vikings at this point. They have a great offense. They're clicking. And what we want to do is we're going to start Kirk Cousins this week. The Packers defense, they seem to struggle in the first half of the game against Mitch Trubisky, coming out in his second year only. He was very effective in the passing game. They got away from it a little bit in that game last week. They changed up the game script at halftime because they had a lead and then seemed to just kind of fall apart. But in the early going, it was very easy for them to throw the ball in the Packers defense. So I think I'm definitely starting Kirk Cousins as a top 10 play for me this week. As far as Dalvin Cook goes, Dalvin Cook is a must start for me again this week. And he started 80% of the snaps last week for the Vikings, which is actually really good for a guy coming off a tear of his ACL. So Dalvin Cook is another guy that you're going to want to start against that Packers defense, especially if the Vikings get up early and get up big. They're going to want to run the ball and pound the clock. Latavius Murray is a sit for me this week. I don't foresee him getting a ton of work unless barring any injury to Dalvin Cook or being completely blown out, the Packers blown out to the fact where to the point where the Vikings are sitting their starters the way that the Ravens did last week. That's the only way you're starting Murray. But on to the receivers, Thielen and Diggs. You have to start both of these guys. They're absolutely ridiculous. They're both top 15, top 20 plays in pretty much any type of format that you're looking at. So you're starting Thielen, you're starting Diggs. They had about the same type of week last week, except for Diggs did have that touchdown against the 49ers. Not starting any other wide receivers for the Vikings. Laquan Treadwell did have a couple catches in the last game, but he's been in the league for a few years now. He was a highly touted rookie a couple years ago and just never seemed to do anything. He only had 20 catches in his first 2 seasons, so I don't foresee him getting anywhere, especially in the fantasy game. Probably a better NFL player than fantasy player. Kyle Rudolph, once again, you're starting Kyle Rudolph. The Packers actually did well against the tight end last week. Trey Burton actually had 6 targets and only 1 catch against the Packers in the middle of that field. So, but I do foresee Kyle Rudolph being a little bit better with that offense and that system that they run with the Vikings. So we're starting Kyle Rudolph this week. The defense, absolutely starting the Vikings defense pretty much every single week. Yes, they are going against Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, but they're still going to, depending on how Aaron Rodgers' knee is, the Vikings are still going to have their sacks. They're still going to have their shots, and especially if Aaron Rodgers doesn't play, which we'll be monitoring throughout the week. I'll mention that in a second here. But if Rodgers does not play, the Vikings defense is probably a top 3 defense this week. But even with Rodgers in the game, they're still top 12. And onto the kicker, if you have Daniel Carlson, he got you a few points last week. He's probably a volume play also as a start for the Vikings. Now, on to the Green Bay Packers, playing at home with Aaron Rodgers. He did go out of last week's game in the first half after it was a sack. Khalil Mack came in on one end, and I don't remember the other defensive end's name, but he came in from the other end and landed on Rodgers' knee. They sent him to the tent. After a few minutes, he ended up on a cart and being carted back into the locker room. Now, we haven't heard anything. Mike McCarthy is still being kind of hesitant to say anything, but I did hear from some person, only speculation, strictly speculation, that it looked like a sprained MCL. Now, I don't know personally. I'm not an injury expert, but we could see later on this week. Just keep monitoring that situation. We'll see if it's Aaron Rodgers or if it's DeShone Kizer. If it is Aaron Rodgers, you're going to want to start him. It's Aaron Rodgers. He's number 1 overall for a reason. He's going to find his ways. As Rob talked about earlier when we were before the video here, he did have that calf injury a couple years ago, and he was still out on the field. They just found different ways to get the ball to the receivers and the running backs. So you're starting Rodgers and sitting DeShone Kizer if he does end up playing. On to the running backs. I do feel like all those running backs are a sit for me this week. I don't see that the Vikings are going to give up very many rushing yards. They have a great front 7. They didn't give up very many yards against the 49ers. Alfred Morris got absolutely stuffed and ended up with actually fumbling on the goal line too. So I would say that you're probably sitting the Green Bay Packers running backs, Jamal Williams and Ty Montgomery, and they weren't very effective even against the Chicago Bears. So I think that Vikings defense is a little bit better than the Bears. They should have just as much of a struggle this week. Randall Cobb, Devontae Adams, and Geronimo Allison, the 3 wide receivers that scored last week for the Packers. I think that the thing with Devontae Adams is his value actually reduces by the fact that Cobb is out there being productive. So I think where the split used to be at Cobb was being drafted around the 40 range and Devontae Adams was being drafted around the 6 or 7 range, they're starting to move where Adams could be like a wide receiver 2 and Cobb could be like a wide receiver 3. And especially this week against the Vikings, that's where I see them sitting. And Geronimo Allison is a non-factor for me this week unless you're in an absolutely desperate situation in a 16-team league. And Jimmy Graham, the tight end for the Packers. Actually, from 2015 to 2017, the Packers averaged about 17% targets per route run to the tight end. And Jimmy Graham ran 38 routes last week against the Bears and only had 10 targets. I'm sorry, 10%. He only had 4 targets. About 10% of the target share per route run, which is actually less than some of the lower quality names tight ends that have been playing for the Packers. So I see Jimmy Graham as probably somebody you're going to need to start if you have him on your team and you drafted him high. But there are some better options on the waiver wire if you want to waste a bench spot and bench Jimmy Graham this week. I don't see that as a problem, especially against a solid Vikings defense and the way that the Packers use the tight end. I wouldn't mind benching Jimmy Graham this week. I guess it all depends on your roster construction. I'm also not starting the Green Bay defense this week. The Vikings offense is high-powered. They're going to score quite a few times, and I just don't think that the Packers are going to be able to hold up. And also Mason Crosby, if the Packers are able to move the ball, they might stall out in the red zone. I would probably see Crosby as a top 16 kicker this week, but kickers are kickers. If they're on your team, they're on your team. That's something I'm going to say all season. So if you have him on your team, you're probably starting him. You don't need to go out there and make a waiver move just for a kicker unless there's somebody like Jake Elliott or Justin Tucker on your waiver wire. So that's what I see with the Vikings at the Packers.
All right. Yeah, Delvin Cook, if you watch that game, he actually struggled early on, but as the game went on, he got stronger and better and more effective. He had one fumble, but I think he's in for a big year. And then we kind of cautioned against Jimmy Graham in a lot of our videos and against Williams. We think Aaron Jones is going to win that job. So if he's out there in your league, I'd grab Aaron Jones. So this is his last week. I think he's going to miss. So
Absolutely.
So that brings us to the Texans versus the Titans. I'll get right into the quarterbacks. I'll look at Deshaun Watson. Some people are surprised, shocked that he didn't have a huge game. He struggled a little bit there. We're not shocked here. We said in our preseason rankings that this guy is good, but he's a little overhyped. I don't care how talented you are. He is very talented. There's a learning curve in the NFL. With that said, he needs to be started. He's not an elite quarterback yet in the NFL, but yet he's a very good quarterback, so I would start him. As far as Marcus Mariota and Matt Castle go, Marcus Mariota left the game injured. His status is up in the air. He was also ineffective even before that happened. So along with his struggles last year and the red flags that we have going on right now with that injury, I would sit him. Matt Castle sounds like he might be the one to start, but I would sit him also, just not take that chance. Let's go to the running backs here. Lamar Miller. Now, he was advertised in the preseason as a volume play with Foreman being out. Now, he looked better this preseason. He lost weight. He looked quicker, and he had a great first game. He had 20 carries, 98 yards, 4.9 yards per carry, so he's a solid running back to start this week. And then Dion Lewis. He had a great game there. Overall, he had 16 carries, 75 yards, and a TD. That should concern a lot of you people that were huge on Derrick Henry. He had a goal line carry there. He also had 5 catches for 35 yards, and we promoted him huge this preseason. We said this guy is solid, and he's going to continue to have a good year. Now, the only concern I have for Dion Lewis is durability. He's not a big back. This week, I see him as a running back, too. If you're in a PPR league, because he's got great hands, he's actually a borderline running back 1. I know some of you are not going to believe that, but trust me with this. Let's get to Derrick Henry. We said over and over in the preseason that he wasn't going to have a breakout year. We got deep into this guy and told you there's some major red flags. We hope you listened to us because he had a bad week. And we think that's going to continue. Now, he'll have some good games, but he's not consistent enough or reliable enough to trust. So I look at him in standard leagues as a running back 4. I would sit him in PPR leagues until things get better there. As far as wide receivers go, you got DeAndre Hopkins. He's a wide receiver 1. You start him every week. It doesn't matter. You need to start that guy. Then you got Will Fuller, Ellington. Texans coach Bill O'Brien is hopeful that Will Fuller hamstring will be ready to go week 2. Now, if he starts, I could see him maybe as a wide receiver 3 in leagues that are over 12 teams, but I'd like to see him have a prove-it game first. I like Will Fuller. I think he's in for a big year. I think he's underrated. I think he's very talented there, but I would like to see him come back, have a prove-it game, get in sync, get in playing shape, things like that. So if you have to start him in deep leagues, you could be a wide receiver 3 if he plays. Ellington, I would probably sit him. Yes, he had a TD last week, but they're playing from behind against the Pats. They had to throw a lot. I think it's unlikely that they're going to be playing from behind in this game per se, so I would stay away. And that's Corey Davis now. Corey Davis had 6 catches, 62 yards. Not a bad game, but it was on 13 targets. Now, he is the team's number 1 wide receiver. That's not an efficient offense. Those aren't great numbers, but I would say he's a wide receiver 3 start this week. He's still the number 1 guy there, and he still has a higher ceiling. Then you got Richard Matthews. You got Sharp and Tywan Taylor, the other 3 wide receivers there. Well, with Marcus Mariota's status questionable and those targets being spread around, really the best wide receiver left of those 3 is Matthews. But the team is bringing him back slowly as he recovers from an offseason injury, so I would sit all 3 of those guys. And then at tight end, you got Delaney Walker. It sounds like he's going to be out for the year now. Terrible injury there. And then Juno Smith is going to take over. Yet I wouldn't start him quite yet. I think that he might be a viable starter down the road, but this first week, I wouldn't start him. I would wait. And I would sit all Houston tight ends just to see, tell one of them distance themselves from the pack. As far as kickers go, Ryan Suckup is solid kicker, but there's so many questions at quarterback that I would rather sit him. It would make me nervous this week. And Kaya Farbarn, how do you always get that name wrong? Farbarn.
Fairbarn.
Is I think he's start worthy. So I'd go ahead and start him. Start Houston's defense, and I would sit Tennessee this week. So that's my take on that game. And that brings us to the Saints and the Browns. You're up.
Yeah, Cleveland Browns. We're going to go right to the quarterbacks, Tyrod Taylor. There's a name controversy there. But anyways, Tyrod Taylor. This week I see him as a start in a 16-team league. He's back in running back. Oh, wow, can't even think. Quarterback one in a 12-team league. I see him in the 11 to 16 range, and a lot of his production actually comes from his legs. So he scored over 20 fantasy points last week and really didn't have a very effective day. A lot of that was due to the weather. But they did have quite a few missed throws and opportunities where he just wasn't connecting. But you're going to start Tyrod Taylor. He's always been a productive guy. He's gets a lot of it with his legs, and that's part of his game. So he's a low-end I keep going back to that. He's a low-end QB1 in 12-team leagues, and he's a must-start in 16-team leagues. On to the running backs. Carlos Hyde actually showed that he is the number one guy there for that team. He ended up with a vast majority of the running back carries, and he's going to be a start this week as a back-end RB2, possibly even a flex play. But given what that Saints defense looked like last week, they did stop the run, although they weren't able to stop the pass very well. So I would start Carlos Hyde this week, although I wouldn't think too highly of him. Probably, like I said, back-end RB2 or flex position. Duke Johnson in PPR leagues, they do move him out to the slot quite a bit. I would toss him in there as possibly a RB3 option in PPR, but other than that, you're not starting Nick Chubb. And on to the receivers, Josh Gordon, Jarvis Landry, and Antonio Callaway. You're probably starting Gordon and Landry. Callaway's a sit for me this week, but Gordon actually looked pretty decent. He had a touchdown last week on a pretty big play, and Landry had 15 targets. So, when the weather's treating the ball nicely, they're going to be able to catch some of those balls, and Taylor's going to be more effective and able to get those balls to them, and they're going to be in the dome this week. So I'm starting Landry. He's going to get a lot of targets again this week, and I'm starting Gordon. He's got that big playability. He's one of the most talented receivers in the league. And David Njoku had a down week last week, but things are going to look up for the Browns in the future here. I'm going to start David Njoku just to run with him this week again and see where we end up. I'm going to give him a couple of weeks before I decide whether or not I'm going to sit him. I'm sitting the Browns defense this week, although they did look decent last week against the Steelers for a little while, and they had quite a few turnovers. I'm going to sit them against that powerful Saints offense. And the kicker, I'm going to sit Zane Gonzalez for the Browns. On to the Saints. You're pretty much starting all the Saints that you have this week. Drew Brees is a top 5 quarterback. He was absolutely ridiculous last week, and a lot of that was game script. He had to throw the ball a lot, but that is what's going to happen this year. Sean Payton's offense last year was kind of an outlier when it comes to that offense. So Brees is actually going to have a bigger year than he did last year, which actually he set the efficiency record, but his touchdowns are going to go back up this year. His passing yards should go back up, and you're definitely starting Brees against that Browns defense. Alvin Kamara and Mike Gillislee, I'm going to start Alvin Kamara as probably a top 5 running back again this week, and I'm sitting Mike Gillislee. And for the wide receivers, Michael Thomas is a definite start every single week. He is not even matchup dependent. He's just a straight start. And Ted Ginn Jr. looked to be the number 2 there. He had a decent day, 5 catches for 62 and a touchdown. He's actually probably a wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues. And even in standard leagues, I think I'd start him as a wide receiver 3. So Ted Ginn is a start for me this week. Cam Meredith is still having some issues with the knee. They didn't get him out on the field. That's one of those situations you want to monitor. But as of now, Ginn and Brees have the rapport, so they are both starts for me. And Traquan Smith, I was really high on him. I'm still really high on him, but he's just not quite there yet. He's having a tough time with the playbook is what they're saying. So Smith is a sit for me. Now that Saints defense, they had a rough game last week, but I'm going to stick it out with them. Marshawn Lattimore is a top quality shutdown corner, and he's going to probably be working on Gordon this week. So I'm gonna go with them. I'm gonna run out the Saints defense this week and start them. And also, you're starting Will Lutz as a kicker for the Saints.
All right, sounds good. Let's take a look at the Jets versus the Dolphins. So look at Sam Darnold, quarterback for the Jets. Congrats on the victory. By the way, he won last night. And he overcame really what could have been a disastrous start. Very first throw of the game is intercepted for a touchdown, but he recovers very nicely. He wins. With that said, even though he looked good, and I'm happy for the guy, he's still a rookie, and he's not proven. I want to take you back to Carson Wentz when he was a rookie. He had a good couple games. Actually, the first 3 to 4 games, he was very good. Defense has adjusted a little bit, and then the next 11 games, he struggled. So I would sit Darnold unless you're in 2 quarterback leagues that are very deep. Ryan Tannehill was serviceable, not great. But I would advise sitting him. The Jets secondary, they got some young, talented guys there, and I'm just not comfortable going with Ryan Tannehill yet. So I would sit him unless you have to go with that. As far as running backs go, you got Frank Gore. He had a nice game. He was effective. But at 35, he's not going to see a lot of carries. He only had 9 in that game, and you can't trust that sort of volume in fantasy. So I would sit him unless Drake gets hurt. That's when you're going to see maybe an increased uptick in Frank Gore's value. And that takes us to Kenyon Drake. I love Kenyon Drake. I still love Kenyon Drake. He actually started the game a very good yards per carry. He looked very effective. As the game went on, his yards per carry dropped a little bit there. He had 3 catches for 18 yards. I think he's in for a very good year. Mark my words on that. He's going to be just fine. I do think there's some concern, though, as Gore continues to be effective. Gore's not going to be the starting running back there, but he might vulture some of those carries that would decrease his value. I think Kenyon Drake is a lower-end running back, too, this week. As far as Isaiah Crowell, this guy was huge. 10 carries, 102 yards, 2 TDs. We said in our videos, this is a guy that's being overlooked. He can be a very good running back. I predicted, and I still say this, he's going to break 1,000 yards rushing this year. I think he's a running back 2 this week. Now, the only concern last week is he only had 10 carries, but 1, that was a blowout win. It's hard to believe. You watched that game. The Jets destroyed the Lions there. Yep. And his role is going to increase with his production, obviously. So I would start him as a running back, too. Then you got Powell. I'm going to say this again. I think Crowell's going to be the starting running back there, and I think Powell's going to settle into a 3rd down back, and he's going to be out there in passing downs or to relieve him. And so I wouldn't trust Powell beyond a running back 3 or flex in PPRs that are 12 teams or larger. That's where I'm at with him. As far as wide receivers go, Kenny Stills had a huge day, 4 catches, 106 yards, 2 TDs. I'm not surprised. I'm not saying he's got an all-pro year. That you should expect that every week. Obviously, don't expect that, but he is their number 1 guy right now, and so and I think it's going to stay that way. Parker's value is falling quickly, and then you look at a guy like Danny Amendola, who's really just a slot receiver to get a lot of targets, but he's got a lower ceiling. You look at Kenny Stills; he's only 26 years old. He's had success. Now the Jets' corners are solid, so it's not a great matchup for him. So I would say because he is their number 1 wide receiver, I would start him in fantasy as a wide receiver 3. As far as Danny Amendola goes, he is a slot receiver. He will see many targets this year, but he's going to have lower yards and probably TD totals. His only value is in PPR leagues, and I see him as a wide receiver 4 in PPR, so I would probably lean towards sitting him. Quincy Enunwa is another guy that we actually talked about in our sleeper video. Had a good day. He had 6 catches, 63 yards, and a TD. He's a wide receiver 3-4 on the bubble there based on your league size. He's a guy that, depending on how large your league is, you could probably consider starting him. Robbie Anderson. They blew that game out. They didn't have to throw much, but he had 1 target. He turned that into 41 yards and a TD. Robbie Anderson's got wide receiver 1 type talent. And so I think he's a guy that you need to start as a wide receiver 2. He's going to get more targets. He's going to be successful there. As far as tight ends go, you got Mike Gesicki. He only had 1 catch, 11 yards. We said rookie tight ends rarely have an impact in fantasy football, so I would sit all Dolphin tight ends, and I would actually sit all Jet tight ends. Neither kickers are good starts here, in my opinion. As far as the Miami defense goes, you could consider starting him against a rookie quarterback. Sam Darnold look good. He may have a decent year, but he's going to make mistakes. So Miami could be worth a flyer in daily fantasy because they're cheap, but you have better streaming option in straight fantasy than Miami. The Jets defense's talent is young, but in that game, Stafford and the Lions turned the ball over a lot. I doubt you're going to see a repeat of that, and so I wouldn't trust the Jets defense just quite yet. So that's my take on those guys. So here for the Steelers and the Chiefs.
Yeah, the Steelers and the Chiefs. This is going to be one of those big games this week. Actually, it's going to be pretty chalk for me. With the Chiefs, I'm going to start with the quarterback, Patrick Mahomes. I talked to him about big in our Boom Bust video, the first video I ever came in and did, and He came out and he had a huge game in week 1. Well, a lot of his production actually came from the receptions and the running ability of Tyreek Hill. He didn't have a ton of passing yards. He was just very efficient when it comes to the passing game. But I'm going to start Patrick Mahomes against the Steelers this week, just based on volume and the way that he showed it in week 1. I'm going to run with him this week as a low end quarterback 1 and mostly 16-team leagues. But I'm going to start Mahomes. And my issue with Kareem Hunt is he's back at his ways, 40, 50, 60 yards and no touchdowns. But, you got to keep rolling him out there. He's RB1 potential. He could easily break a 75-yard touchdown in the snap of a finger. So I'm running with Kareem Hunt this week, but I'm not starting any other running backs for the Kansas City Chiefs. When it comes to the wide receivers, Tyreek Hill, he's probably a wide receiver 1 in 12-team leagues, possibly even a high wide receiver 2, but you got to keep him out there. Him and Mahomes just seem to have a good connection, and he's one of the fastest guys in the NFL. He can break a tackle. He can take a 3-yard slant 90 yards to the house at any given time, and he actually took one of those 60 yards in the game against the Chargers this week against a very good Chargers defensive secondary. I'm actually sitting Sammy Watkins. I do not want any part of Sammy Watkins in fantasy football right now as of this point. He has disappointed. He gets these big contracts. He was a highly touted NFL talent, and as an NFL player, he's probably a lot better, but as a fantasy player, I'm not touching Sammy Watkins. I will sit him this week. Travis Kelce had an off week last week, but there are better days to come for Travis Kelce. If you have him on your team, you're definitely starting Travis Kelce this week against the Steelers. And that Chiefs defense, I'm actually going to sit the Chiefs defense this week, and I'm not playing the Chiefs kicker against the Steelers. For the Steelers, Ben Roethlisberger, definitely starting Ben Roethlisberger this week. He had a rough week against the Cleveland Browns, but like I said in the past game there, the weather played a factor in that. He had 3 or 4 interceptions, I think it was 3, and weather was actually a factor in 2 of those balls is what it seemed like. So Ben Roethlisberger is going to come out, and he usually plays a lot better at home. That home road split thing is more than just a superstition at this point. It's fact. You can look it up. He averages over 20 points at home and under 15 points on the road over the past 5 seasons. So he's the only quarterback to do that. So I'm starting Ben Roethlisberger, and he's got great weapons around him. James Conner actually run very effectively against the Browns. Essentially, in what was 5 quarters, he played 100% of the running back snaps and had 192 total yards and 2 touchdowns. And they just prove that it is their system. They promote and they scout and they bring up these great running backs, and they can just run the ball all over every other team, and James Conner is the next one to come up. So I'm starting James Conner this week as probably a low-end RB1, high-end RB2 in almost every type of league. And the wide receivers, Antonio Brown, you're starting him every single week. Juju Smith-Schuster, he's probably going to have a bounce-back week this week. He gets a lot of those balls that catches high at the point, or where he just straight outruns somebody. And in the weather in Cleveland, he wasn't able to do that last week. But things should look better in Pittsburgh this week as of right now. So Juju is probably a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. But you're starting Juju if you have him on your team. And James Washington didn't really play last week. Justin Hunter got some of the targets. He actually had a touchdown that was called back, but you're not starting Justin Hunter or James Washington in any of your leagues. And I'm going to avoid Vance McDonald and Jesse James this week because Vance McDonald didn't play last week, and Jesse James had some of the targets. But as of right now, it's one of those situations where we really don't know who's going to be the guy. Seems like it's going to be McDonald, but he's still coming off of an injury, so I'm sitting both of those guys. I will start the Steelers defense if I have to in a 12-team league, 16-team league as a very low end, maybe even a streaming option, but I don't want to based on the volume of what Patrick Mahomes did last week to the very good Chargers defense. But I guess that's a 16-team league. I would start them at the back end of a 16-team league, and you're definitely starting Boswell as a kicker because he does have great leg strength, and that offense is very athletic and talented. They should be able to score some points.
All right, let's get to our next game. So I'm going to get right into the quarterbacks here. Nick Foles. We're looking at the Bucks versus the Eagles. Nick Foles looked bad in the preseason. He looked worse in Week 1, if that's possible. Now, he does have a very nice matchup against a porous Buccaneers defense. Now, concerns I have is Jeffrey looks like he's going to be out. So if I look at Nick Foles, who has struggled, has a good matchup, but for me, he's outside the top 20. So if you have to start him, you could. But let's not remember that, yeah, Tampa Bay's defense gave up a lot of points last week, but that was to Drew Brees, and Nick Foles is no Drew Brees. So he's got a good matchup, but he's not in the top 20. Ryan Fitzpatrick exploded last week. The Saints defense looked terrible, but now he faces Philadelphia. That Philadelphia defense is good, and they made Matt Ryan last week look very pedestrian. Now he does have very good weapons around him, so you could start him in deeper leagues, but for me, Ryan Fitzpatrick is out of the top 16. Let's look at running backs. Jay Ajayi. I think you need to start him as a high-end running back too. We said all summer that he was going to be good. Now he had lower carries, but Doug Peterson came out after the game and said that was his fault. That they didn't use him more in the first half, and that going forward they're going to get him more involved in the game. He had very good yards per carry. The only concern I have for Jay Ajayi at this point is not him, but Nick Foles' play. I think that entire offense gets bogged down, slowed down, so I think that hurts a little bit. But I think he's a guy that you need to play against a very bad Tampa defense. All other running backs I would sit simply because they're not going to get a consistent amount of touches to trust them. Let's look at Tampa Bay's running backs. Peyton Barber. He's solid. He's locked in as the uncontested starter there, so you need to consider him as a low-end running back 2, running back 2/3 in PPRs. I would sell all other backs at this point. As far as wide receivers go, I look at Nelson Aguilar. I would start as a wide receiver 2 with Jeffrey out. He was used a lot last week. He actually ran the ball. He threw the ball. He was targeted 10 times and had 8 catches for 33 yards. So I think you need to start him as a wide receiver 2 until Jeffrey comes back. You got Mike Wallace. I would sit Mike Wallace. I would sit all other wide receivers for Philadelphia until either A, Nick plays better, or Carson Wentz comes back, which hopefully he'll come back soon here. Look at the wide receivers. Mike Evans had a huge game 1. He's a wide receiver 1 stud. You need to start him. Don't even think about it. Then you got Chris Godwin and Deshaun Jackson. They both had really good games. Jackson was huge, but he is in concussion protocol. So we'll have to see how that plays out. So monitor that this week. Now I see Jackson's wide receiver 4. If he plays, I would sit him. And here's why. Last week, yeah, he had a big game, but he scored 48 points. They're not going to do that this week. And the concern I have is that there's so many weapons there. You got Howard, Bray, Jackson, Godwin, others. He only had 5 targets. Now he maximized those 5 targets, but that's not a lot of volume there. And so my concern is that after Mike Evans, there's so many other guys there that I just wouldn't trust him this week against Philadelphia. I would start Chris Godwin if Jackson sits. The reason why I would do that is if Jackson sits, that means that some of those targets could go his way. Otherwise, if Jackson plays, Chris Godwin is another guy that's a wide receiver 4. I probably wouldn't start simply because the target distribution there. As far as tight ends go, O.J. Howard was efficient, not great. I would start him as a tight end, kind of 2 or 3, and I would sit Cameron Brate. And I would start Zach Ertz as a tight end 1. I would start Jake Elliott, and I would start Catanzaro. I think Catanzaro is actually not going to be a bad play. I think they'll be able to move the ball a lot, but I think the Philadelphia defense is decent. Sometimes that's a nice matchup for a good kicker play. I would start Philly's defense, and I would sit the Buccaneers defense. They're brutal. So that's my take on that game. That brings us to the Redskins versus the Colts.
Yeah, we're going to start with the Indianapolis Colts. We're going to start Andrew Luck this week. Now, he did have a decent game, 53 passing attempts last week. A lot of that was game flow. They were ahead early and still passing the ball, but then they got behind and they had to throw the ball a little bit more. He was slightly effective. He did have a decent game. We're going to start Andrew Luck. He's top 10 quarterback anytime he's in the game, so may as well just do it and not even think about it. And as far as the running backs, though, if Marlon Mack comes back this week, he's probably going to be ahead of Jordan Wilkins for me, but also still not going to be in that running back 1, 2, or 3 range for me. I don't know until I see it. Mack and Hines are going to be the 2 guys that I like in PPR. And if Mack comes back, Wilkins kind of gets phased out for the time being. Now, Hines did have a decent game in PPR, but I'm not starting any of these running backs against the Washington Redskins. When it comes to the wide receivers, T.Y. Hilton is a must start. He's absolutely going to be a starter every single week. As long as he's healthy and Luck is healthy, those 2 are going to connect a lot. And Ryan Grant actually was a surprise last week. He had 8 out of 9 targets that he caught for 59 yards. We knew he was going to be the wide receiver 2 for the most part, but we just didn't know how productive he was going to be. A lot of that could have been the fact that they threw 53 times, but still he had a high catch rate and did something with it. So Ryan Grant is actually going to be a wide receiver 4 for me this week, but keep an eye on Ryan Grant to see, he could get a little bit more production. If he scores a touchdown there, his day is totally different. He's wide receiver 3 potential. And for the tight ends, Ebron and Doyle. Doyle's still higher for me, although Ebron did score more points last week. A lot of that was just by the fact that he had the touchdown. The targets and the receptions went to Doyle. He did have a fumble, but I'm starting Doyle and still going to sit Ebron. He's on the brink of that 16 to 20 range. He's probably closer to 15 or 16, but I'm still sitting him for this week and starting Doyle for the tight ends. And the Indy defense is brutal. I'm definitely sitting the Indianapolis Colts defense, and I would start Vinatieri because they can move the ball, and once they get it within field goal range, he can hit from all over the field. So I'm starting Vinatieri for the kicker of the Colts. When it comes to the Redskins, I'm definitely starting Alex Smith this week because the Colts defense is kind of brutal when it comes down to it, and Alex Smith is a very good quarterback. He can run the ball, he's got weapons, he's got Jordan Reed, he can pass out of the backfield, and they didn't go to the wide receivers very much, just got a game script last week, but he does have 3 solid wide receivers in Crowder, Doxson, and Paul Richardson. So I'm definitely starting Alex Smith this week. He had a decent game last week, and he should continue with a even worse defense this week. In the backfield, Adrian Peterson, Chris Thompson are the only 2 guys I would consider. I think Peterson is a running back 2 this week, and Thompson is a flex option or RB3, especially in PPR leagues. But both of these guys are going to get their time because they both have their carved out roles. Peterson is the pounder, the goal line guy and the first and second down guy, and Thompson's the third down guy. Sometimes when they're on the field together, Thompson will still get the catches out of the backfield. So they both have their roles, and they're both starters in their own right this week. For the wide receivers, the only guy I would consider this week is Jamison Crowder, and that would be a back end wide receiver 3. I want to see it first. Josh Doxson is a wide receiver 5 for me, and Paul Richardson is basically a non-factor in fantasy at this point. So Crowder I would consider as like a wide receiver 4, maybe back end wide receiver 3. But I would probably sit most of those guys. You're going to have better options in your league. And Jordan Reed, I'm definitely starting Jordan Reed until the day inevitably comes where he gets hurt. Jordan Reed is going to be a top 10 fantasy tight end for you, and that's the only option there. Vernon Davis, I'm not going to start Vernon Davis at this point. The Redskins defense, they're actually better than you would expect for the team, the way the team's been over the last few years. I actually would consider streaming the Redskins defense, or like you said earlier about one of the Dolphins, you might want to get them as a cheap fantasy daily option. But in most of your 12-team leagues, you're probably not starting the Redskins. In bigger leagues, deeper leagues, you might end up starting them as your defense. And Hopkins, I would start Hopkins, the kicker for the Redskins. They should be able to move the ball and get in a field goal range, or he'd be kicking some extra points. So I would start Hopkins this week.
All right. That brings us to the Rams and the Cardinals. So look at last week, the Cardinals' offense was brutal. So whether it's Sam Bradford, Josh Rosen, doesn't matter. I would sit both of those guys. They're playing a Rams defense that is very good. Sam struggled last week against a Redskins defense that's decent but not spectacular. And Josh is a rookie, so I would sit both those guys. Jared Goff is a start. I would start him. Let's get the running backs. Todd Gurley, you don't need me to tell you to start this guy. Obviously, you're going to start him every week. He's matchup proof. And then David Johnson had kind of an off week, but he still found the end zone. This is a guy that's got 33 touchdowns in 34 games. You need to play David Johnson. Even if that offense struggles, you're going to start him. As far as wide receiver go, you got Woods, Cook, and Cooper Kupp. They're like a 3-headed monster there, and I like all 3 of those guys. And all 3 of those guys I see as wide receiver 3s, unfortunately, actually still targets from each other. And so that's the downside. If one of those guys were to go down with an injury, those other 2 wide receivers will suddenly become wide receiver 2 options. Right now I see him as wide receiver 3. The safest play there is probably Cooper Kupp because he's so widely used out of the slot. He gets a lot of targets. As far as the wide receivers for the Cardinals, I would start Fitzgerald as a wide receiver 3. I would sit everybody else. As far as tight ends go, I would sit the Rams tight ends. And then I know it's tempting to start Ricky Seals-Jones. I actually like him. I think he's got a lot of potential there. But you can't trust him yet until the offense gets better, until he develops into that role better. I would sit him. I would start Greg Zuerlein. I would sit Phil Dawson. And then I would start Rams defense, and I would sit the Cardinals defense in that one. So that's my take on those games. Let's move on to the next one. Lions and the 49ers.
Yeah, we're going to start with the Detroit Lions. I know it was a rough game for Matthew Stafford, but there are better days to come for the Detroit Lions. He did go out of the game and come back in with a little bit of an injury. I'm sure you're watching, but I do feel like we can start him this week against the 49ers. Like I said, there are better days to come, and he just has so many weapons in that Lions offense. So I'll start Stafford this week. And when it comes to the running backs, I'm going to sit LeGarrette Blount, and I think I'm going to sit Kerryon Johnson this week. I know he looks to be the number one guy, but it just doesn't seem like he's got very much production, very much value when it comes to running backs. So even in a deep league, I think maybe even a 16-team league, he could possibly only be a flex option, but he's way down there in the 28 to 35 range for running backs this week for me. Theo Riddick is a non-factor. He might do better in PPR leagues, but as of right now, there are a lot better options at running back, so I'm not starting any of the Lions running backs. When it comes to wide receivers, Kenny Golladay is actually the number one, actually the highest targeted offensive wide receiver for the Lions last week. He did have a lot of production. Marvin Jones had less targets, still caught 4 balls for 54. But I think you could start all three of these guys as wide receiver, back-end wide receiver 2 for Golden Tate, high-end wide receiver 3 for Marvin Jones, and low-end wide receiver 3 for Golladay. I just foresee these guys as being like you said with the Rams, a 3-headed monster when it comes to receivers, and they all steal targets from each other. So I think they're going to have a better week this week, and you can start all three of them against the 49ers. We're not starting Luke Wilson as a tight end for the Lions. I'm not starting the Detroit Lions defense, and I will start Matt Prater. The Lions should be able to move the ball, and they do have a pretty good offense, so they should be able to get the ball down in the area where Prater can kick from, and he's got a good leg, so he can kick it deep in that San Francisco Levi Stadium. When it comes to the 49ers, Jimmy Garoppolo, he didn't have a horrible week against the stout Vikings defense. I will start him this week against what seems to be a pretty putrid Detroit Lions defense. I'm going to start Jimmy Garoppolo as a back-end QB1, and hopefully he will show me better things this week. He did have just 1 touchdown pass last week, but he had 2 of them that were called back that could have easily changed his day. I'm going to start Alfred Morris this week, and things are going to look up for that backfield as well. Matt Breida, however, is possibly a running back 3 in PPR leagues, but as of right now, it's Alfred Morris's job to lose, and he does have the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield slightly. He did have a brutal couple years with Dallas, but he had a decent time when he was with Kyle Shanahan in Washington. So I will start with Alfred Morris and sit Breida unless you're in a deeper league. He's probably an RB3 in deep PPR. Marquise Goodwin, we're still going to monitor his knee issue, leg issue, but I'm definitely starting Pierre Garçon if Goodwin is out as a wide receiver 2. And if Goodwin is in, I think both of those guys could be viable wide receiver 3 options for the 49ers. I don't think that Dante Pettis is going to be an option unless Goodwin is out. And even then, I still need to see it a little bit more. I think he's probably a high-end wide receiver 4 with no Goodwin there. And Garçon's going to get most of the looks. But we're going to start George Kittle this week. He had a pretty solid day against what is a very good Minnesota defense. He actually led the tight ends this week in yards after the catch of all tight ends. That was up until Monday night's game. I don't know how Jared Cook did in that area, but we're going to start George Kittle this week as a tight end 1 in 12-team leagues, sitting the defense for the 49ers and starting the kicker for the 49ers.
All right. Look at the Raiders versus the Broncos. So let's look at Derek Carr. He had a tough week versus the Rams, threw a bunch of picks. They have a good defense, but now he plays the Broncos, who front 7 gave Russell Wilson fits. I would sit Derek Carr. I think Derek Carr is going to have a good year. I think he's going to get on track, just probably not this week. I wouldn't trust him yet. Look at Case Keenum. He had a nice week, over 300 yards passing and 3 TDs. Now, he did throw 3 interceptions, but overall, he did have a good week, and I think he's got nice weapons around him there, so I think he's a guy that you could start. As far as running backs go, you got Marshawn Lynch. He actually looked strong in the field. He looked physical. He looked like the old beast mode. He did have a touchdown. I would start him as a running back 3. He'd be lower in PPR leagues. He's not highly involved. Now, as the rest of the running backs there for Oakland goes, you got Richard Martin, Washington, if he comes back. But they spread the ball around so much between them as far as targets and carries. I wouldn't trust any of those guys. I would sit them. If you have to start one of them, it'd be Richard or Richard. And PPR leagues, he did have 9 catches. So he does have some inflated value in PPR leagues. The problem with it is Washington and him are very similar in their build. Their skill set's very similar. So if Washington happens to come back, they're going to really chip away at each other's carries there, touches. So they can start me. I'd stay away from that. I would start Freeman, running back for Denver. He had 15 carries, 71 yards. That's a good game. I want to tell you there, I know a lot of people are worried about Lindsey in that role, but I'm going to tell you right now, Freeman will be the workhorse of that team. He's going to be the guy that's going to enjoy the carries. He's big, he's physical. I think he weighs like 233 pounds. Don't worry about the fact that Lindsey had a good week 1. I would start Lindsey in PPR leagues. I would actually sit him in standards. Now, here's why I would caution getting too excited about Lindsey there. I like him. He's explosive. He's fast. Same thing last year happened to Tariq Cohen. Week 1, week 2, he was huge. People came out, said that's a running back by committee. Jordan Howard has no value. We said, no, that's not going to happen. He's too small of a back in the NFL. He's not going to get a lot of carries like that. They're going to use him as a wide receiver. They try to get him out in space. I think Lindsey's going to be very similar. Lindsey's only 190 pounds. He doesn't have the size to take the wear and tear of the pound in the NFL. Freeman's going to get a majority of the carries when it's all said and done. I think Lindsey's role is going to be very similar to like a Darren Sproles. And that's why I see that playing out there. So that's my take on that. As far as wide receivers go, I would start Amari Cooper. He's talented enough that you can't ignore him, but he faces a tough Denver defense, so he's a wide receiver 3 this week. Jordy Nelson, I would sit him as a wide receiver 4. I wouldn't play him. And then Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders both had good weeks. I would start both of those as wide receiver 2s. I would sit Jake Butt. He showed potential, but not enough to start yet. And then Jared Cook had a huge week 1. He's really underrated, and Carr looked his way a lot, so I would actually start Jared Cook there. I think that they're going to dump the ball off a lot to him, especially with Denver bringing pressure. I would start kicker McCandless. He had some long field goals there, and that offense looked like it's going to move the ball better than it did last year, and I would sit Nugent. I would start Denver's defense, and I would sit the Raiders' defense. So that's my take on that game. Now we got the Patriots and the Jaguars.
Yeah, on to the game of the week, and we're going to start off with the Patriots. I mean, we're going to start Tom Brady. There's no need to get crazy here. Obviously, it is the Jaguars defense, but you're still starting Tom Brady against them, so that's pretty simple there. Moving on to the running back situation, Sony Michel might be back this week. We don't know yet. Rex Burkhead should be the guy there, and James White will be a pretty solid factor coming out of the backfield. Jeremy Hill did have a little bit of a knee issue, so he's not going to be playing. But I like James White in PPR leagues as Tom Brady's safety valve there. He likes to go to him. They've been together. They built a rapport over the last few years. So in PPR leagues, I actually started him in a 16-team league as my RB2 last week, and he produced for me. I do like James White as definitely a RB3 in PPR. You probably aren't starting him in standard. He's touchdown dependent, but Burkhead and Sony Michel, if they do play, I don't really foresee them. They're probably going to steal targets or touches from each other, so I would say James White might be the only option in PPR. Other than that, in standard, you're not starting any of these guys. Chris Hogan actually had a really down week 1. But if you remember, he had a down week 1 last year too, and then the next 4 weeks he came out and he was wide receiver number 3 in all of the NFL. But he does in this year see Jalen Ramsey in week 2. Now, Odell Beckham had a great week against Jalen Ramsey, but that's Odell Beckham. That's not Chris Hogan. So I think I'm going to sit Chris Hogan this week. I'm sitting Philip Dorsett because the defense doesn't get much better on the other side. And the wide receiver options, although they may have signed Corey Coleman, it's going to take him a while to get involved in that offense. So I don't see any wide receiver options for the Patriots being viable this week either. Definitely starting Rob Gronkowski. That's a no-brainer. There's nothing to even think about there. A lot of the targets are going to go to him or James White from Brady, and he'll find one of those wide receivers. We just don't know which one of them it is yet. So start Rob Gronkowski. I don't mind the Patriots defense this week. They actually did do well against the Houston Texans last week. They had Lamar Miller, Deshaun Watson, and DeAndre Hopkins to deal with, and they held him to only 6 points over the first 3 quarters. So that Patriots defense is better than advertised, and I do like the Patriots defense a little bit this week, especially if Leonard Fournette's going to sit and they have to force Blake Bortles to throw the ball. So I'd start the Patriots defense as a low-end defense in a 12-team or 16-team league, and you're starting Steven Gostkowski every single week as long as you have him on your team and he's healthy. On to the Jaguars. Now, Blake Bortles, I'm sitting Blake Bortles this week. We don't really have a whole lot good to say about Blake Bortles. I know he did have a streak last week where he was a number one quarterback for 5 weeks, but that's an anomaly. That's not what we see over the length of his career. He's actually quite turnover prone, so we're sitting Blake Bortles. The TJ Yeldon is probably going to be the starter if Leonard Fournette were to miss any time with that hamstring. You're going to want to monitor that situation. Even if he does have a hamstring issue and he does want to play, we need to watch that because he could tweak it again and end up coming back out of the game. So I thought it was going to be Corey Grant there for a while in the preseason, but it looks like TJ Yeldon, and he does catch balls out of the backfield. So good RB2 option. If Fournette plays by himself as the RB1 and he's completely as the running back and he's completely healthy, he is an RB1 on the back end this week for the Jaguars. And when it comes to the wide receivers, Moncrief actually moved himself down into the wide receiver 3 for the team, but none of these guys are really options in fantasy game because Keelan Cole and Dede Westbrook, although they are good NFL players, as of right now, we just don't know who it's going to be. And in PPR leagues, they're back end, probably wide receiver 3 if you have to start them, or high end wide receiver 4 for the Jaguars wide receivers in fantasy. And I'm not starting Austin Seferian-Jenkins. I'm not starting Niles Paul. And I would start the Jaguars defense. You're probably going to start them every week, no matter who they're playing, even if it's Tom Brady. So we're starting the Jaguars. And if you have Josh Lambo on your team, let's start Josh Lambo this week for the Jaguars.
Okay. Giants and the Cowboys. So I'll get right into Dak Prescott. I would say to him, his woes continue. They don't have a lot of weapons there now. He will move the ball better this week than he did last week against the Panthers, but I would sit him. Eli Manning, we advised sitting him last week against a very good Jags defense. This week, I think he's worth a starter, and actually deeper leagues, I think that offense is going to continue to get better, and they're going to be fine. Running backs, Barkley, Elliott, you need to start both those guys. They're running back 1 stud. You need to start them. And I would sit all other running backs in this game. As far as wide receivers go, start Odell Beckham as a wide receiver 1 stud. And I would start Shepard as a wide receiver 3 in 12-team leagues or higher. I would sell other wide receivers for Dallas. Cole Beasley, if you had to start one, maybe in PPR leagues, but honestly, none of those are great plays. Dallas has got to work some stuff out there. As far as tight ends go, I would sit Dallas tight end until somebody emerges from that group there. And I would start Evan Ingram. I think he's a very good tight end, though he had a quiet week 1, but that was against the Jags. As kickers, I would start Rosas, and I would sit Dallas as kicker. I would start the Giants defense in big leagues, and I would sit Dallas defense. Doesn't matter what size league you're in. So that's my take on that game. I think it's up to you now for the final game, right?
Sure.
Here we go. Seattle.
Seattle at the Chicago Bears. Unfortunately, I'm going to start Russell Wilson this week. I mean, you really can't deny his abilities, and he just produces every single week. Although he lost his number 1 receiver, looks like for a few weeks here at least. You got to start Russell Wilson. He didn't rush a lot last week, but he does have the ability, and he does have a couple other guys he can throw the ball to. So you're starting Russell Wilson. He might move down as a back end quarterback 1, but he's still in that quarterback 1 range, especially in 12-team leagues. On to the running backs. I don't think I'm going to start Rashad Penny. Chris Carson did look good. He did have a catch that was called back for 44 yards, but he ran well, 7 for 51, so he's clearly the number 1. They do have Penny. They're splitting the touches basically 50-50 this past week, but I think in fantasy value you're going to want Carson, not Penny, so we're going to play Carson as a high-end RB3 and not Penny. And when it comes to the wide receivers, like I said, no Doug Baldwin for a while there. Both of his knees have some injuries there, and it looks like Brandon Marshall is actually going to be the guy that steps up. Tyler Lockett, Jerron Brown. So with all 3 of these guys, I think one of them is going to be the guy. We just don't know who it's going to be yet. We did like Tyler Lockett a lot coming into this season, and I think Tyler Lockett's probably going to be the guy to get the most targets. So I would start Tyler Lockett in a larger league as a wide receiver 3. I'm going to sit Jerron Brown and sit Brandon Marshall just for this week to see if last week was an outlier or if that's really what's going to happen. And speaking of outliers, that rookie tight end, his name's slipping my mind right now, but that was not Disley. Yeah, Disley. Actually, he came out of the combine as more of a blocking tight end. They said he didn't have hands, so last week was kind of a freakish play type situation for him. We're not starting Disley, we're not starting Vanette, we're not starting Ed Dixon there for Seattle. And I would not start the Seattle defense, and I would not start Sebastian Janikowski this week either. So kind of a rough week for the Seattle fantasy team, but yeah, we'll move on to the Bears. Mitch Trubisky, he was very effective in the first half against the Packers, but I don't think I'm starting Mitch Trubisky this week. Although I said I wasn't starting the Seattle defense, I just don't see it from Trubisky quite yet, especially in 16-team leagues, 12-team leagues, or anything smaller. So we'll wait and see on Trubisky. Jordan Howard, actually, he's going to be an RB1 back end or a high RB2 for me this week. He caught all 5 of his targets this week, so when they said he was working on his hands over the offseason, I definitely seems to show right now. So we're going to start Jordan Howard. We're going to sit Tariq Cohen. And Allen Robinson, he's a wide receiver 2 for me this week. And we're going to sit Anthony Miller. We're going to sit Taylor Gabriel. And Trey Burton, he's still going to get the targets. He's a low-end tight end 1 for me, as he did see a lot of targets. He just couldn't turn them into catches last week, so that should change eventually here for Trey Burton. I think I said Taylor Gabriel, but I meant Trey Burton. Starting the Bears defense, Khalil Mack gave the Green Bay Packers some fits last week, and with a bad offensive line for Seattle, he's going to do the same. Russell Wilson's going to be running for his life out there, and have Roquan Smith coming at him too. The Bears defense is a great play this week, and you're going to be starting the kicker for the Bears, Cody Parkey.
All right, perfect. Thanks for joining us today at the Penspell Profits. If you have any questions, thoughts, concern, matchups, what it is, put a comment on the bottom. We'll love to answer it. Once again, good luck. Hope you have a good year. God bless. And take care.